In 1879, Thomas Edison stood before the world and unveiled the electric light bulb. Newspapers celebrated him. Textbooks immortalized him. A legend was born. There was just one problem. He didn't invent it. 5 years before Edison's famous demonstration, two men in Toronto had already solved the problem. They had filed the patent. They had built the bulb. They had made the light work. Their names were Henry Woodward and Matthew Evans, and almost nobody knows them. What happened between their workshop in Toronto and Edison's triumph in New Jersey is not a story about science. It is a story about money, about power, and about who gets to write history when the other side can't afford a lawyer. This is the story of a Canadian invention, an American buyout, and a lie that has been taught in classrooms for over 100 years. Toronto in the 1870s was a city on the move. Factories were rising along the waterfront. Rail lines pushed deeper into Ontario's interior. The smell of coal smoke and horse sweat hung over the downtown streets from morning until dark. But when the sun went down, the city dimmed. The gas lamps that lined King Street and Yonge flickered with a pale, unsteady light. They were expensive to maintain, dangerous to operate, and prone to filling rooms with a slow, invisible poison. Every winter, fires broke out in homes and businesses where a lamp had been knocked over or a fitting had worked loose. The light they produced was better than nothing, but only just. Across Europe and along the eastern seaboard of the United States, inventors and industrialists could sense that something better was coming. Electricity was no longer a curiosity. It was becoming a force. Laboratories in London, Paris, and New York were racing toward the same goal. Clean light, reliable light. Light that did not burn your house down. Henry Woodward understood the problem as well as anyone. A medical man by training, he had the kind of mind that moved from symptoms to causes, from questions to solutions. He was not a factory owner or a financier. He was a thinker who worked with his hands, and he had been turning the problem of electric light over in his mind for years. Matthew Evans was his partner in this, less documented by history, but present at every step. The two men worked together in the way that serious inventors always do, testing, failing, adjusting, testing again, each failure narrowing the distance between the idea and the thing itself. What made their situation different from the laboratories of London or Menlo Park was not their ability. It was their circumstances. Toronto in 1874 had no ecosystem for turning an invention into an industry. There were no networks of venture capital, no industrial patrons looking to back the next great technology, no government programs designed to move a Canadian idea from a workshop bench to the factory floor. The men who controlled money in Ontario were cautious by nature and skeptical of anything that had not already proven itself elsewhere. Woodward and Evans had something rare. They had the answer to a problem that the entire industrialized world was trying to solve. They had arrived there through discipline and intelligence, working in conditions that would have discouraged lesser men. What they did not have was anyone willing to back them. That gap between a working invention and the capital needed to bring it to the world would cost them everything. On July 24, 1874, Henry Woodward and Matthew Evans filed Canadian Patent Number 3738 in Ottawa. The document still exists. It describes, in precise technical language, a method for producing electric light using a carbon filament suspended inside a glass bulb filled with nitrogen gas. The nitrogen was the key. By replacing the oxygen inside the bulb with an inert gas, the filament could glow at high temperature without burning away. The light was stable, controllable, and reproducible. This was not a rough sketch or a half-formed idea. It was a functioning invention, documented, tested, and registered with the Canadian government 5 years before Thomas Edison would stand in front of a crowd in New Jersey and accept the world's applause. The moment the patent was filed should have been the beginning of something. In a different country, with a different industrial infrastructure behind them, it might have been. Instead, it marked the beginning of a long and demoralizing search for money that would go nowhere. Woodward and Evans needed capital to manufacture their bulb at scale. The materials, the facilities, the workforce, the distribution, none of it was free. They approached investors in Toronto. They made their case to businessmen in Ontario. They explained the technology, demonstrated the results, and laid out what was possible. The answer, again and again, was no. The men with money in Canada in the 1870s had not built their fortunes by betting on the unproven. Railways and timber and real estate were known quantities. An electric light bulb was not. It was strange and untested, and it required a leap of imagination that most investors were simply unwilling to make. Each rejection pushed the two men further into a corner. The patent they held was a ticking clock. Without the capital to develop and commercialize the invention, it would eventually expire, and everything they had built would dissolve into nothing. There is something particularly painful about this part of the story. Woodward and Evans had done everything right. They had identified the problem. They had solved it. They had protected their work through proper legal channels. They had sought partners through legitimate means. The system had no place for them. By the mid-1870s, it was becoming clear that if a future existed for their invention, it would not be built in Canada. The country simply did not yet have the industrial architecture to take something from a workshop and turn it into a revolution. The question was no longer whether their light bulb worked. The question was whether anyone with the power to do something about it would ever come knocking. Someone would. But the price of that knock would be everything. By 1877, Thomas Edison was not a man who went looking for problems to solve. He was a man who went looking for problems that had already been solved and figuring out how to own them. His reputation by that point was already formidable. The telegraph improvements, the phonograph, the long list of patents that had made his name synonymous with American ingenuity. He was celebrated in newspapers, courted by investors, and backed by some of the most powerful financial interests on the eastern seaboard. When Edison expressed interest in a technology, capital followed. Menlo Park was the physical expression of that power. It was not a lone inventor's workshop. It was an industrial operation staffed by engineers, machinists, chemists, and lawyers, all working in coordination toward a single goal. Find it, refine it, patent it, monetize it. The genius of Menlo Park was not invention. It was process. Edison's team monitored everything moving through the world of electrical research. Patents filed in London, experiments published in European journals, quiet work happening in workshops in cities that most Americans had never thought about. When the Canadian patent filed by Woodward and Evans came to their attention, it was not treated as a curiosity. It was treated as an asset worth acquiring. The approach to Woodward and Evans was not accidental. Edison understood precisely what he was looking at. A functioning design, legally protected, held by two men who had exhausted every option available to them. The negotiation, if it can even be called that, was brief. Woodward and Evans had no leverage. They had a patent that was costing them time and producing no income, and a window that was closing. Edison had money, lawyers, and patience. The outcome was not in doubt from the moment the conversation began. In 1877, the two Canadians signed over their rights. The price has been described as modest at best, a figure that bore no relationship to the value of what was being transferred. They had no choice, and they knew it. A small sum in hand was better than a patent that would expire unused in an Ottawa filing cabinet. With that signature, the invention left Canada and entered the American industrial machine. Edison took the design back to Menlo Park. His engineers went to work. The nitrogen gas inside the bulb was eventually replaced with a vacuum, a genuine technical refinement that improved the filament's longevity. That work was real. But the foundation, the carbon filament, the sealed glass bulb, the principle that made it all possible, had come from a Toronto workshop 3 years before Edison's team ever touched it. He had not invented the light bulb. He had bought it. On the evening of October 21, 1879, Thomas Edison demonstrated his electric light bulb to a crowd of reporters and investors gathered at Menlo Park. The timing was not accidental. The guest list was not accidental. Nothing about that evening was accidental. Edison understood that the demonstration of a technology and the invention of a technology were two entirely different things, and that in the court of public opinion, the man who put on the better show would own the story forever. He had spent 2 years refining the Woodward and Evans design, replacing the nitrogen atmosphere with a vacuum, extending the life of the filament, preparing a performance that would be impossible to ignore. The newspapers did not disappoint him. Within days, headlines across America announced that Thomas Edison had invented the electric light. The stories were vivid, celebratory, and completely devoid of any mention of a Canadian patent filed 5 years earlier. There was no reference to Woodward, no reference to Evans, no reference to Ottawa or Toronto, or the two men who had solved the core problem before Edison's team had even begun working on it. This was not an oversight. Information about prior patents was not difficult to find for anyone motivated to look. The journalists who covered Menlo Park were covering Edison, and Edison's story did not include footnotes that complicated his genius. The mechanism that erased Woodward and Evans from history was not a conspiracy in the dramatic sense. It was something quieter and more durable. It was the simple fact that Edison controlled the narrative because he controlled everything else. The money, the laboratory, the lawyers, the press access, the public demonstrations. When you own all of those things, the version of history you prefer tends to be the one that survives. Joseph Swan, an English inventor who had been working on similar problems at roughly the same time, faced a comparable erasure in the American telling of the story. Edison eventually reached a legal settlement with Swan, and the two formed a joint company in Britain. But in the American textbooks, Swan barely rates a mention. The pattern was consistent. The Woodward and Evans patent sat in the Canadian archives, legally intact, available to anyone who wanted to find it. The evidence was never hidden. It was simply never amplified. History does not always require a villain who destroys the truth. Sometimes it only requires a void where the correction should have been, and no one with enough power to fill it. Woodward and Evans had built the thing that lit the modern world. Edison had bought the rights to be remembered for it. And the world, for over a century, never thought to ask why. Henry Woodward lived out the rest of his life in quiet obscurity. There was no second act, no belated recognition from a government that might have celebrated what he and Evans had achieved. No industry built in Ontario bearing his name. No scholarship, no statue, no street in Toronto that carried any trace of what he had given the modern world. He had held in his hands a solution to one of the defining technological problems of his age, and he had died without the world ever acknowledging it. Matthew Evans disappeared from the historical record almost entirely. The man who had worked alongside Woodward through years of testing and refinement, who co-signed the patent that should have changed everything, left behind almost nothing that history bothered to preserve. No biography, no archive of letters, no photograph in a gallery of Canadian inventors. He is, for most purposes, simply gone. What the two men lost was not only credit, it was consequence. Had the light bulb industry been built on Canadian soil, the ripple effects across Ontario's economy would have been profound. Manufacturing plants, supply chains, research institutions, the entire infrastructure of a new technology, all of it would have taken root north of the border rather than in New Jersey. The loss was not sentimental. It was structural. Canada lost an industry before it ever had the chance to know it was losing one. The pattern was not new, and it would not be the last time. The Avro Arrow, canceled under American pressure and scrapped before its potential could be realized. The McLaughlin automobile empire in Oshawa sold to General Motors on a promise of Canadian control that dissolved within a generation. Pablum, developed by Canadian doctors at Toronto's Hospital for Sick Children, and handed to an American company for a fee that bore no relationship to what it was worth. The story of Canadian invention is, too often, the story of ideas that left the country before the country understood what it had. In classrooms across Canada today, children are still taught that Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. The patent filed in Ottawa on July 24, 1974, does not appear in the curriculum. The names Woodward and Evans do not appear on the walls of science classrooms or in the chapters of history textbooks. The bulb glows. The credit goes elsewhere. This is not a story that Canada stumbled into by accident. It is the result of 100 small decisions made over generations to accept the version of history written by the people with the resources to write it loudly. The truth was always there. It was just never powerful enough to drown out the noise. The evidence was never missing. Canadian patent number 3738. Filed in Ottawa, July 24, 1974. 5 years before Edison's famous night at Menlo Park. Henry Woodward and Matthew Evans solved the problem. They built the bulb. They filed the paperwork. Then they ran out of money, and America ran off with the credit. History is not always written by the winners. Sometimes it is written by the people who could afford the ink. The next time you turn on a light, you know whose idea it really was. 2 Canadians, 1 patent, and a story that is long overdue.